When a thick fog rolls in over the shores of Odesa, old sailors try not to look toward the sea, because they know an old legend. They say that sometimes, out of the fog, a ship appears. A ship that sank many years ago. It moves slowly along the coastline, as if it's searching for someone among those who dare to watch the sea. I used to think it was just a legend, until one night, in the heavy fog over the Black Sea, I saw it myself, a ship emerging from the mist. The Ship from the Fog, an Odesa legend of the Black Sea. I don't know if you'll believe me. To be honest, for a long time I tried to convince myself that what happened that night was just my imagination. The fog, the exhaustion after a long shift. Maybe it was one of those things. But there's one problem. I remember that ship far too clearly. Many years have passed, yet I can still see it as if it happened yesterday. A dark silhouette on the water, silence all around, and a thick fog hanging over the Black Sea. Back then, I worked at the port of Odesa. Night shifts were normal for me. At night, the port looks completely different. Less noise, fewer people, only the waves quietly hitting the pier, and somewhere far away the dull hum of ship engines. But that night, the sea was unusually calm. Even the seagulls, which usually scream almost without stopping, had disappeared. A strange silence filled the air, the kind that makes you feel uneasy without knowing why. I was standing on the pier, looking out at the dark water. The lamps lit up the concrete and a small part of the sea near the shore, but beyond that began a black, almost impenetrable darkness. That was when the fog started rising from the open sea. At first, I didn't pay much attention. It happens often over the water, but this fog was different. It moved slowly, like a living thing. A white wall creeping toward the port, swallowing the horizon. Within minutes, the sea ahead was almost completely hidden, and that's when I saw it. At first, it was only a dark silhouette in the fog. I thought it was just a ship heading toward the port. That happens all the time, but something immediately felt strange. There were no lights on the ship. None. No signal lights. No lights on the deck. It simply drifted through the fog, like a shadow. I stood there watching it, trying to understand what was happening. And then I noticed something even stranger. The sea was completely silent. I couldn't hear an engine. I couldn't hear the churn of propellers. The water wasn't even moving the way it should when a large ship passes nearby. The ship was moving, but the sea remained perfectly calm. That was the moment I first realised something was wrong. But the most terrifying thing I noticed a little later, when the fog parted for just a moment and I saw its deck. And that was when a chill ran down my spine. At first, I couldn't understand what exactly had unsettled me. The ship was old. That was obvious right away. Its hull looked dark, almost black, as if the wood or metal had long ago been soaked through by the sea. Its shape was strange. I'd only seen ships like that in old photographs hanging in the portmaster's office. But that wasn't the only thing. The deck was empty. I couldn't see a single person. No sailors, no captain. Not even a light in the windows. The ship was slowly approaching the pier, silent and dark, like a shadow drifting out of the fog. At first I thought the crew must simply be inside, but the longer I stared at the vessel, the stronger the feeling grew. Something here was terribly wrong. Usually when ships enter the port they signal their arrival. A horn sounds, signal lights flash. Here there was nothing, only the fog and that ship. I took a few steps along the pier to get a better look. Then the fog parted again. On the side of the ship I saw old letters, almost worn away. The name of the vessel. At first I couldn't read it. The paint had peeled off, and the wood looked as if it had spent decades lying on the seabed. But a few letters were still visible. Maria, I frowned. The name felt familiar. I had heard it somewhere before. At that very moment a quiet voice spoke behind me. "You see it too?" I turned sharply. Behind me stood the old night watchman, Mikola. He had worked at the port for as long as I could remember, maybe even since before I was a child. His face was pale. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the ship. "What ship is that?" I asked. Mikola stayed silent for several seconds. Then he said quietly, "It shouldn't be here." I looked back at the sea. The ship was already very close. The fog slid along its sides like something alive. Why? I asked. Mikola slowly shook his head. Because that ship sank, long before I started working at this port. A cold weight settled in my chest. What do you mean? The watchman stepped closer to the edge of the pier and whispered, Old sailors used to talk about it. More than 100 years ago, a ship disappeared in a storm not far from Odesa. It was never found. Only pieces of wreckage. And its name was... Mikola looked straight at the dark silhouette in the fog. Saint Maria. At that moment, the fog suddenly began to move faster. It twisted around the ship as if something alive was wrapping itself around the vessel from every side. And then we heard a sound. Quiet. So quiet that at first I thought I had imagined it. A creak. Like old wood slowly bending under the weight of time. The creaking was coming from the deck, but on the ship, there was still no one there. And that was when something moved on the upper deck. The footsteps were getting closer. Slow, heavy, as if someone were descending from the upper deck along old wooden stairs. I froze. The silence around us was so deep that I could even hear the soft slap of water against the ship's hull. Mikola grabbed my sleeve. Don't turn around, he whispered. But I was already looking. From a dark passage on the deck, a figure appeared. It moved strangely, slowly, as if every step required great effort. The fog slid around its legs. The figure approached the railing and stopped. Now it was very close. Close enough for me to see its face. And that was when I realised Mikola had been right. It wasn't human. The clothes it wore were old, something like a sailor's uniform from many decades ago. The fabric looked soaked and torn in places. But the most terrifying thing was the face. The skin was pale, almost grey. The lips were dark, as if the body had spent far too long underwater, and the eyes were open, but there was no life in them, only darkness. The figure was staring directly at the pier, at us. For a moment it felt as if time itself had stopped. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. Suddenly more figures began to emerge from behind the first one, another, then another. Now there were more than 10 shapes standing on the deck. They silently stared toward the shore, and one by one, their heads slowly turned in our direction. Mikola gripped my arm tightly. They're searching, he whispered. For who? I asked, barely able to breathe. The old man didn't answer right away. He stared at the ship as if he could see something I couldn't. Then he said quietly, They're searching for those who saw them. At that moment, one of the figures stepped close to the railing. The old wood creaked beneath its weight, and then, slowly, a rope slid down from the ship. It dragged along the side and touched the pier, like an invitation, like someone offering us a way aboard. A wave of cold ran through my body, and then the figure standing in front slowly opened its mouth. At first, I thought it was about to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, a strange rasp escaped its throat, as if its lungs were filled with seawater. And then I heard the words, quiet, almost a whisper, Come back, to the ship. At that moment, Mikola yanked me backward. Run! We ran along the pier without even looking back. Behind us, the old wood creaked. Ropes slapped against the hull, and from the fog came new sounds. Footsteps. Many footsteps. As if from the ship onto the pier, something very old was beginning to climb down. And that was when I realised the most terrifying thing of all. This ship had not appeared in the port by accident. It had returned, for a new crew. We ran along the pier without looking back. All I could hear was my own heavy breathing and Mikola's hurried footsteps beside me. My heart was pounding so loudly it felt like the entire port could hear it. Behind us the wood was still creaking, as if someone was slowly walking across the old boards of the pier. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to make sure we had imagined it all, but Mikola said sharply, Don't look back. His voice was quiet, but there was a fear in it I'd never heard before. We reached the guard shack. The old man threw the door open and practically dragged me inside. He slammed the door shut, turned the key in the lock, and only then allowed himself to breathe. Inside the room, a dim lamp was glowing. An old desk, a radio, a kettle. Just an ordinary night watch cabin. But now it felt like the only safe place left in the world. I looked at Mikola. What was that? He stayed silent for a long time. Then he slowly sat down on the chair. His hands were trembling slightly. "I heard about that ship from old sailors," he said quietly, "but I always thought it was just stories." "What ship?" Mikola raised his eyes to me. "The one that sank in the Great Storm, more than 100 years ago." He nodded toward the sea, now hidden by fog. "They said the entire crew disappeared with the vessel. No one survived." "And?" Mikola slowly rubbed his face. "And sometimes, when the fog comes in from the sea, people in the port see the ship." The room fell completely silent. I felt the cold run down my spine again. "You're saying that was the same ship?" The old man didn't answer. He simply stared out the window. I turned toward the glass as well. From there we could see part of the pier, and the fog, thick, almost white. I stared at it for a long time, and then something moved in the mist. A dark silhouette. I leaned closer to the window. The ship was gone. The pier was empty. No ropes, no traces, as if nothing had ever happened. I was about to tell Mikola, but then I noticed something else. On the wet concrete of the pier there were footprints, dark, wet, like the marks of bare feet. They stretched from the edge of the pier, straight toward our shack. Slowly I moved my gaze to the door, and at that exact moment, someone knocked. 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Mikola looked at me. His face had turned completely white, and then we heard a quiet, rasping voice behind the door. "Open the door!" The voice was soft, almost a whisper. "We're from the ship." We froze. The room became so quiet that I could hear the faint crackling of the old lamp above the table. There was another knock on the door. Knock, 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 slow, patient, as if whoever stood outside knew that sooner or later we would open it. Mikola slowly raised his hand and pressed a finger to his lips. "Quiet," he whispered. I almost stopped breathing. We stared at the door. Something was standing behind it. Something that had come from that ship. The voice spoke again, this time a little louder. "Open. We need to come in." There was something strange about the words, as if the speaker had forgotten how people were supposed to talk, as if every word required enormous effort. I slowly looked at Mikola. He quietly shook his head. "Don't answer," he whispered. Silence fell outside the door. For a moment I thought maybe it had gone away, but then the door handle slowly moved. The metal creaked softly. Someone was trying to open the door. The lock shuddered. Mikola jumped to his feet and pressed his shoulder against the door. I rushed over and helped him. From the other side, something began to push slowly. The door groaned, and then we heard another sound. Footsteps, many footsteps, wet, slow. They were approaching the shack, as if several more, from the ship, had come to the door. Mikola whispered, "They can't come in unless we let them." "How do you know that?" I asked quietly. The old man closed his eyes for a second. "Because this is the old sea, and the old rules." Outside, the voice spoke again. This time it sounded different, quieter, colder. "We need a crew." My heart skipped a beat, and then I heard something that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. Another voice near the door whispered, "He saw the ship." And several voices murmured together, "Then he can come with us." My hands began to tremble. Suddenly Mikola grabbed the old radio from the table and threw it to me. "Turn on the port siren." "Why?" "Just do it." I pressed the button. At first nothing happened. Then suddenly a long piercing sound rose over the night port. The siren. It wailed so loudly that the windows rattled. Outside the door everything went silent. The pressure against the door vanished. The footsteps stopped. We stood there without speaking for several seconds. Then Mikola slowly opened the small window and looked out at the pier. The fog was beginning to fade. The pier was empty. No figures, no footsteps, and the ship on the water was gone, as if it had never appeared at all. Only the dark marks of bare feet remained on the wet concrete. They stretched from the edge of the pier and disappeared right in front of our door. That night, I never went back onto the pier. A few months later, I quit working at the port entirely. Many years have passed since then. I tried to forget that ship. Sometimes I even convinced myself it had all been a strange dream. But one night, many years later, I was sitting in a small bar by the sea. It was late. An old radio was playing in the corner, and suddenly the announcer began reading the news. He said that fishermen near Odesa had spotted a strange old vessel in the fog that night. No lights, no signals. I froze, and the announcer calmly added, "According to eyewitnesses, there were people standing on the deck, watching the shore." And that was when I realised something terrifying. That ship never disappeared. It is still sailing through the fog over the Black Sea, and sometimes it returns to Odesa, because a ship that died at sea will always need a new crew. Always needed. Many years have passed since the last time I worked at the port. Life slowly became ordinary again. Work, home, familiar faces, everyday routines. Sometimes it even felt as if that night had been nothing more than a strange memory that would eventually fade away, like a footprint on wet sand. But some things never disappear. Sometimes they simply wait. Every autumn, thick fog rises over the sea. Old fishermen say it's just a natural thing. Cold water, warm air. It happens often. But whenever I see that fog, I always feel the same thing. As if the sea is hiding something. A few times I even came down to the waterfront on purpose on nights like that. I would just stand there, staring at the dark water. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to convince myself that the ship no longer existed. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it had all been just a frightening story. And every time, the sea was empty. Only the waves quietly rolled toward the shore. Only the fog drifted slowly above the water. But one night, everything changed. It happened a few weeks ago. That evening the city was almost empty. An autumn wind pushed cold air from the sea, and once again the fog began to gather above the water. I stood on the waterfront looking toward the horizon. At first I noticed nothing unusual, just darkness over the sea. But then a silhouette appeared in the fog, very far away, barely visible. I felt my heart begin to beat faster. My mind told me it was just an ordinary vessel, but deep down, I already knew the truth. The silhouette grew clearer, and with it came that familiar feeling of cold. The ship slowly emerged from the fog, dark, old, with no lights anywhere on its deck, exactly the same as it had been that night many years ago. I stood frozen, unable to leave, unable to look away. The ship wasn't moving toward the shore. It was simply drifting along the coastline, as if searching for something or someone. The fog parted for a moment, and then I saw the figures on the deck. They stood along the railing, motionless, dark. There were many of them, and all of them were looking toward the city, toward the shore, toward the people who had no idea that in the fog near Odesa, a ship was passing that should not exist. A cold shiver ran down my spine, because at that moment I realised something. This time, the ship wasn't entering the port. It was simply passing by, as if it were checking the shore, as if it were searching for someone among those who stood by the sea. And just then, one of the figures on the deck slowly turned its head toward me. And that was when one of the figures on the deck slowly turned its head toward me. I stood completely still. For a moment it felt as if only a few meters separated us, even though the ship was far out at sea. The figure was staring directly at me. The fog parted for a second, and I saw its face. The same grey, wet face with dark, empty eyes. I had seen it before, many years ago, that night at the port. It was Mikola, the old watchman. He slowly raised his hand, and just as slowly pointed toward the shore, toward me. Then the fog closed around the ship again. The silhouette dissolved into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all. I stood on the waterfront for a long time, staring at the sea. The waves quietly struck the stones. The city went on with its life. People walked, laughed, and talked, never knowing that sometimes in the fog near Odesa, a ship passes by that sank more than 100 years ago. A ship without lights, without a living crew, but with those who can no longer leave the sea. And do you know what frightens me the most? Not that I saw that ship again, but that just as I was about to leave, the wind suddenly carried a quiet whisper from the sea. Very quiet, almost impossible to hear. We will return soon, and somehow, I know, one day, the ship from the fog will sail into the port of Odesa again.